Hello, welcome everybody, and very happy Monday indeed. I am Ryan Starr. I'm happy to be here, logging in from the West Coast of the United States. Say hello in the comments. Tell us where you're logging in from. And certainly if you're like on the fence between tests or you're thinking about one test or the other, you've been studying for a test, put that in the comments too. Really, just use the comments at all because you'll be able to ask questions through the comments later on, but only if you get familiar with it now. You see, all my comments right now are from GMAT Club, which frankly I like, but everybody say hello, be welcome, and use the comments throughout the presentation for any comment or question or whatever that you want to put out there into the YouTube world where nothing ever goes away. We will start in just a minute as we wait for a few more people to show up. Fingers crossed. All right. So today, we've gathered here to talk about whether to take a test. Alexandra's here, joining from Denver. Harsh is here. Hello. Welcome. Denver is an amazing place that I haven't been to in way too long, and I need to get out there. I miss it. I miss all of Colorado. All right. Welcome. Welcome, real humans. It is nice not to be all alone. That's the truth. Hello, Kunal. India, also a place I've not been to in far too long. But once upon a time, I traversed the Punjab. Abhishek, welcome. Abhisheks, I should say. Hello, Felix. Excellent. Excellent. Welcome, everybody. I once wandered around Delhi, India, and I got a dole, a big green dole, and now my friend has it, and he never lets me play it, which, what is that? Oh well. All right. Let's get down to business. Should we take a test? And if we've got to take a test, which one should it be? I'm almost inclined to just say flat out, take the executive assessment. If only it were that simple. Ebenezer, welcome. All right, let's talk. So we all know, I think, that for getting into business school, there are often tests required, right? Certain business schools, especially among the most prominent of the business schools, require a test. Now, that's changed over recent years for a couple of reasons. Obviously, the pandemic is one of them. It was harder to take a test for a while before they got the online testing going. And even then, schools were a bit leery of the online tests because it seemed like it might be a bit easier to break the test, cheat, who knows what. But schools have been like gaining their trust in the online test. There's still, as we're going to see a bit later, a small percentage of schools that probably prefer the in-person test to the online test, but not a major contingent at all. Either way, schools started moving away from a huge reliance on the test around pandemic times. And some schools were kind of on this trend for a while, and the pandemic just pushed them over the edge. It seems as though the other force at play here is that schools are indeed just moving away from tests slowly, progressively. We see it in undergraduate institutions where the SAT is no longer quite as required and quite as sterling as it used to be. We see it in business schools as well. Most prominently, I think MIT last year or the year before went very test optional, and it seems as though more schools are going to be joining in on that. The EA has kind of given schools a nice stepping stone, it seems, to maybe not requiring tests in the future, given that it's like the GMAT, but lighter, much lighter than the GMAT. We'll talk more about that. And so, okay, here's what we are going to discuss. Whether you should take a test at all right? What the factors at play should be in deciding whether to take a test. If you're going to take a test, which test is right for you? We'll talk about the differences in the 3 major tests for business school. And then at the end, some practice problems. We will have some problems. They'll be on the screen. We'll talk about how they work and what that might mean for which test you end up going with. I expect the bulk of the presentation will be in talking about the 3 tests, their similarities, their differences, and what the study experience for those tests will be like. All right. In the meantime, ask questions. I'm going to try to keep one eye on the chat window. So if you see me looking down a lot, it's not because of my reputation for modesty, it is, but it's also because the chat window's down there and I want to see if anybody's asked something. And forgive me if I take a minute to notice your question, but I'm going to notice it. All right. And I want them. Please ask all the relevant questions you want. Ask some irrelevant ones. Just see if you can knock me off balance. You can. That's the short answer. All right. Let's talk about whether you should take a test at all. Talk about the factors at play. First and foremost, do any of the schools you really want to go to absolutely require a test? If so, that's an easy one. Take a test. Boom, done. If that's the boat you're in, just wait for the next part. Which test should I take? All right. But obviously, there are schools that don't require a test any longer, and there's still going to be other factors at play. So, for instance, do you need a way to demonstrate quant or verbal competence? Now, this is a big one. The way schools see these tests is kind of in the same bucket as your GPA from undergraduate studies, from any graduate studies that you've undertaken, right? And so if your GPA is less than stellar, as mine was in undergraduate, you probably want the test to reassure schools, no, you know what? That undergraduate GPA, that was a long time ago. Forget about that. This is what I'm capable of now, right? The test gives you a chance to kind of refresh your academic image in terms of how you portray that to the schools you're applying to. All right. And the same goes for specifically quant competence or specifically verbal competence. So for instance, in my undergrad, I did 1 or 2 quarters of calculus and did okay in them. Probably don't need to demonstrate a huge amount of quant competence to schools, especially because, of course, my job requires that I do all the quant stuff for the tests, right? So my quant competence is not to be questioned by the schools, right? But by that same token, I also studied languages. I majored in languages in undergrad. And had I not taken any calculus, and certainly had I not had this job, or had I spent my whole career only teaching the verbal side of tests, I would have to demonstrate some quant competence to the schools. And the test would help me do that, right? So if you've been working in a job that's fairly quantitative, investment banking, private equity finance, things like that, engineering, IT. If you have done an undergrad that is fairly quant demanding, you probably don't have much to prove to the schools in the way of your quantitative abilities, all right? Because you've got practical hands-on quant skills, all right? Verbal, same sort of deal, okay? If you did a heavily quantitative thing in undergrad, if your work has been heavily quantitative, you probably use the test as a way to demonstrate verbal skills. If you did your undergraduate or even your graduate studies at an institution where the dominant language spoken was not English, right? Then this is an opportunity to let the schools know, yeah, I did my undergrad not in English, but I've obviously got mad English verbal skills too. Check out my test score. All right. That's the sort of thing that schools tend to want to know from the test beyond just, can this person handle an academically rigorous exam? Okay, that's the general thing, but there are quant and verbal concerns specifically, and that actually changes a little bit how schools see your quant and verbal scores. All right, and how much they weigh your quant and verbal scores. If you've been in a heavily quantitative field, you might think kind of classically, oh, then they're going to want to see a wonderful quant score, but the truth is, not necessarily. They will probably let you in with a bit of a normal or average quant score, a bit more toward the average anyway, even for top schools. They might be looking more to your verbal score to make sure that that is on the up and up, because they trust that you can do quant on a practical level. All right. So if you need a way to demonstrate, consider taking a test. You don't necessarily have to. You can demonstrate it in other ways. For instance, your application essays are also going to be a good way to demonstrate your verbal prowess. It's just that the test is taken in a controlled setting, and anybody could have written your application essays theoretically. I don't think that schools really think that that's necessarily the case, but schools do like the controlled setting nature of one of the standardized tests, which again is why they were a bit leery about the online test initially. All right. If, however, you don't need any way to demonstrate your quantum-verbal competence, you wear it on your sleeve. Anybody who knows you can tell you are competent in quantum verbal. Then still another consideration would be whether you're looking to get grants, scholarships, funding, basically, if you're looking to get funding. So the test is not the only way that they will determine whether you will get merit-based funding, but the test is a factor, especially for certain scholarships or fellowships or things like that, okay? If you are hoping to get some decent funding to go into a school, the test can really help with that. I've had students score in, say, the mid 700s and who've gotten scholarships specifically from that. By contrast, I've had students score in the high 600s, low 700s get into schools. Those students tend to receive less in the way of scholarships. And that's tend to. It's not a sure thing, but a high test score can definitely open the door to more funding from the school as just part of your admissions offer. All right. Let's see. I'm seeing your question, Harshal. If you've done your studying where the language of teaching and answering the questions in the exam was in English, that is probably a pretty good demonstration of your English competence. Yeah, I would think that that would suffice. And so if you know, your scores were great, you've got good recommendations and things like that, you're probably okay with that. And similarly, like if you've gone to an undergraduate institution in which the main language was not English, but you say majored in English, you're going to be fine for having demonstrated your verbal prowess. It's a good question, and keep them coming. All right. If you're looking to get funding, consider taking a test. That funding can be major. All right. I had somebody score 740 in recent times, got into Harvard, and was given, I want to say, something like $40,000 on top of it, right? And the only thing that can make getting into Harvard Business School better is getting tens of thousands of dollars to do so. And if the test can unlock that for you, then the test should be seen in that sense as an opportunity, especially because you don't necessarily, even if you take the test, have to submit a score to the school. If your school is test optional and you're taking it just to see if you can get a high enough score to get some funding, it's basically a no loss proposition. All right. Now, one consideration that is pretty deep down, but a good one to talk about. If you're applying to any schools with lower test averages, if you are, such that taking the test and doing okay on it will actually look like an asset to those schools, go for it. And I'm thinking about schools maybe like in the top 20 to top 30, top 20 to top 40 range. It's not only those schools. Certainly, if there's any school in the 10 to 20 range that have a lower test average, again, the test can be a really good way to distinguish yourself without having to put in all the time and effort to get a really tip-top score. All right. That said, those schools will tend to be a bit easier to get into anyway, as evidenced by their lower test average, perhaps. And so you could certainly get away with not doing it, but it is an opportunity, right? A lot of these lower ones are cases in which your test should be seen as an opportunity. Even consideration too, whether you need to demonstrate quant or verbal competence, the test is an opportunity to do that. In the absence of the test, you might leave the school with questions to which they simply cannot get answers. All right. But key thing is, if you're going for one of these, like, it would be nice if I had a test for blank options, again, you don't have to submit a test just because you've taken it. You can take it and cancel the score, not send out a score, decide later which schools, if any, you want to send the scores out to, etc. All right. Oh, that is, these are great questions. All right. So, if you have a lower GPA, the test you should go for is going to be determined more by the content of the test. But certainly, if you have a lower GPA, you're looking to take a test again as an opportunity to demonstrate. We're going to talk about the differences among the tests in a little bit, and that hopefully will help you determine which test to take. Vinayak, in terms of if you want to go into investment banking in the USA, then I'm going to say this later, but short answer is GMAT. Take the GMAT. All right. So if none of those considerations apply to you, don't take a test unless you're planning on going into investment banking in the US, in which case, or I would say even consulting in the US, probably take a test. And a few other of the kind of, I don't know, I think of them as high ticket commerce industries. It can be beneficial to take a test. And interestingly enough, it can be beneficial to try to get your IR score as high as possible on the GMAT, if indeed you're taking a GMAT with a view to getting into investment banking later on. All right. It's not just your IR score, but your IR score can play a significant role in it. Okay. Great questions. Absolutely keep them coming. If you're thinking about tests, you'll probably want to consider when your application deadlines are and what that will mean for your study period. So just really quickly, typical deadlines for round 1 and 2 are September and January. This is for full-time MBA applications that are set to start in the fall of the year. That's usually the biggest cohort. So if you're looking to start in fall 2023, you would be applying in fall and winter of 2022, 2023, right? First round applications will be September of this year. Second round applications will be January of, I guess, next year. So about a year from now. And then third round applications will be in the kind of later winter, early spring of next year. And as you can see, it's usually better to put more of your applications in the round 1 and round 2 windows. I found from my students that round 2 seems to be the sweet spot. A lot of people get in round 2. Even those people who are like desperate to apply by round 1 and end up having to push it to round 2 because of the test or because getting everything together for the application just took longer than they expected, round 2 applications go well. All right. Round 3 applications, you're kind of hoping that your profile just kind of meets what the schools still need to round out their classes. And that can work really well. Round 3 applications can sometimes surprise you in that maybe you don't have what would be typically considered a strong application, but there's something the schools see there that makes them say, yeah, you know what? We really want this person in our program. We like this person. Round 3 can be good for that, but it is very hit and miss. All right. Round 1 application, Sandeep, is the application round in which a lot of the the people who really want a certain school apply, a lot of the go-getters, a lot of the I don't know, the people that I am not seem to apply in round 1. And so you're competing with a lot of people who really have it together. And you're competing for a certain number of slots. No school is going to give away all of its slots in round 1. They're definitely going to save some slots for round 2 and round 3. And so really the biggest difference in the rounds of applications is whom you're competing with in those rounds of applications. But as I said, it seems like round 2 is a really nice round to apply in. And again, this is anecdotal and by proxy, but it seems like round 2 is a good one. Really, it just, the main difference from a logistical standpoint is how many slots the schools have open in any of these rounds. Does the GMAT give the best start to anybody's career? Asks Shashikant. And the answer is that really depends on how you do on the GMAT. Honestly, it can. Again, the test is an opportunity to have something like that. And it also depends on what career you're going into. But it can also not function that way, and that might depend on how well you're able to do on it, right? And so I don't want you to look at the GMAT and say, okay, this is like the only best way to start my career, and if I don't do well on it, might as well pack it up, not going to have a career. But it can give you a leg up in certain careers for sure. All right. Pranav, 7 years experience, terribly low GPA. What GMAT score should you target? Yeah, taking GMAT for you, I think I agree, is absolutely a no-brainer, right? Though the GRE or the EA might also work. The GMAT probably is going to be the one to go. Now, what GMAT score you should target depends on what schools you're applying to, but assuming you're applying to or hoping to apply to a school in, let's say, the top 10, you really want to get your GMAT score. I would say probably, and this is a hot take, don't necessarily take this without a grain of salt, but probably a 720 or above, honestly, for a top school application. And 720 might be a little bit on the low side for top 3, but it still at least puts you in the mix, and it does a lot to remedy low undergraduate GPA. All right. And if you're several years out of the undergrad GPA, they're willing to definitely forgive that. But again, then they're relying pretty heavily on a test score to show that you're ready for the rigors of the program. All right. Raj, unfortunately, I don't even have the updated list on which schools have made it optional. It seems to change by almost, the month, or certainly by the application round. I'm not too sure. The real advice there is, first, decide which schools you are interested in, and then second, see how they're treating the test. Though I think we could probably together do a Google search and figure out which schools were at a certain point in the recent past doing test optional. It's just, the annoying thing is it's impossible to keep up. Some schools made it optional and then brought it back. Some schools have kept it optional, and you never know what kind of dating you're getting when you do that sort of Google search. I would be not surprised if somewhere on GMAT Club somebody is keeping a list of schools that have made the test optional. So that might be a good place to search, because the GMAT Club people are, of course, on it and keep things up to date. All right. All right. Pusha, you want to go to NYU Stern? You did well in undergrad, though it was Kentucky University. I think Kentucky University. Do you need to take a test? Possibly not. NYU was being pretty nice about using undergrad GPA to let people in, though, as I recall, they were at the beginning just making it about NYU undergraduate GPAs. And so if NYU has gone fully test optional, then there's a really good chance that if your undergraduate GPA was good and you graduated with distinction, you can use that to impress them. One of the best pieces of advice I can give you guys, though, is talk to people from the schools you're interested in applying to. Talk to them about whether, your undergraduate GPA from whatever university is good enough to support an application, or if they really think you should take a test. And you might want to talk to a couple of people. Show up at their kind of open house events, which many of which at least are online still, and talk to admissions and outreach people. And they'll usually give you the straight story. I know sometimes it can feel like they're just giving you talking points. Sometimes they are, but a lot of times they will actually tell you straight. It's like, no, you don't have to worry about the test, or yeah, you should probably aim for this sort of score, things like that. Okay. Definitely talk to people from your schools. They have staff people whose entire function/role is to talk to people about stuff like that. All right. If somebody has 15 years of education and a decent score, then yeah, he or she can absolutely have the opportunity to get into a top 10 school. Obviously decent score is somewhat subjective, but I would say if somebody has like 15 years of undergraduate experience and a score anywhere from the high 600s upward, that person is very much in the conversation. And it'll depend on, say, work experience and essays and recommendations and stuff like that, because the kind of experience, the at least academic experience bucket will be set, will be in good shape. All right. These are all great questions. Late with GMAT for 2022. Should I apply in round 3 in March, or should I drop for this year and apply for 2023 in September? Rishab, that's a great question. Honestly, I would say probably apply in March of this year. If you can get a good application together in time for that, there's nothing wrong with applying in March of this year. If they say, no, sorry, not right now, that puts you in kind of an ambiguous position, because you don't know if they rejected your application because of something in the application, or because you simply weren't what they were looking for to round out their class in terms of your, say, work experience and stuff like that for that particular round, which means it's unclear whether you need to improve your application to reapply then in the fall, which would be the next step, or if you can reapply with the same application and just having applied in a different round, your application is viewed differently. But again, I would say talk to somebody from the school about that with that specific question. I would still probably lean on the side of apply this year. If you've got your application stuff together, you might as well take your shot in the last round, and you can always take that same information and reapply in the fall, worst case scenario. And if that gives you, like, if you get rejected and it gives you some time and motivation to somehow improve your application between then and fall, even better, essentially. So aside from the application fee, it almost feels like it's a no-lose proposition to apply in the spring. Schools absolutely don't look down on people who have been rejected before and apply later. Not at all. In fact, all evidence suggests that, if anything, they like it. It shows dedication. It shows you're serious about going there. So you can absolutely do that. Let's see. Unless you have 5 years of experience, GPA 3.41. Can you give a GRE instead of GMAT to get into top business schools round 3? Yes, absolutely. Like, look, in fact, let's get to how the schools view the tests. The short answer is schools that accept both the GMAT and the GRE view them about equally. Now, the score thresholds are somewhat different, and the efforts that might require would be somewhat different, but you can absolutely apply with the GRE if you're feeling it's your stronger test. All right. Does volunteering in NGOs count towards work experience? Absolutely. Like, look, it doesn't count as work experience as such if it's volunteering, but it does go on your application, and it can absolutely just count in terms of how schools see it. I have a friend who got into Oxford's MBA program largely because of the non-work related stuff that she was doing with her life. Doing engaging in programs to help women, help immigrants, and things like that in the UK. And they let her into Oxford, gave her a full scholarship because of that stuff, more than because of her GMAT score, which was, I'm sure she doesn't mind me saying, not very good, and in terms of her job history, which was fine, but they really looked at the stuff that she was doing beyond the job as the reason she was allowed in. So while it can't maybe stand in for proper work experience, it absolutely can be included in your work experience, in your essays and stuff like that, and it can definitely sway hearts and minds in admissions. All right. Balash, 670 is a good score for some European business schools. I would say that it's right on the edge of good for LBS, and it's probably a bit low for INSEAD, but for all the other European business schools, it's a good enough score. In terms of getting a job after graduation, probably the GMAT opens more doors than the GRE does. Not, a huge number of doors, but more doors. And also not Mordor. I don't know why I made a Lord of the Rings joke there, but it happened. We have to live with it now. Sorry, YouTube. All right. If you're looking to apply in September, you really want to study for the exam in the months prior to the months before September. And this is all this screen is saying. If you're thinking about taking an exam, you want to save a couple of months to get all your application stuff done. And while I've had plenty of students do both at the same time, it is hard to do both at the same time. All right. So there we go. Let me see. I know I missed questions. I'm trying to get to all of them. Indian applicant, GMAT of 720. Probably try to get a score above 750. And I wouldn't say for admissions purposes. I think the 720 would be good enough to get into top schools. I think that you might want to push it to a 750, obviously, to increase your chances somewhat, but also to increase your chances of maybe getting funding for those schools or things like that. Certainly, if you have the time, it couldn't hurt. All right. Vinayak, I don't know much about masters in finance at all, honestly. This would be if anybody has an answer to Vinayak's question about better schools in the US for masters in finance, please answer, because that is a program I know I have very little even experience by proxy with. All right. Tips for a great application. Good essays and a good test score and good essays are the things you can most control in your application. Okay. You can't necessarily control who your recommenders will be. You've kind of got that in your life already. You can't massively change your work experience. And if you try to do NGO volunteering to pad out your resume. If you do it right before you're applying, it doesn't really count for much because people get the sense that it was a bit self-serving, but you have the most control over test scores and essays. And I would say, short of test scores, essays are going to be the best way to increase your application's viability. Like, make a really compelling story. Show the school how you fit with them and how they fit with you and your life and your plans and all that stuff. And try to get your voice across. Don't try to write an essay like other essays you've seen. Try to write an essay that gives the reader a sense of who you are and what you might be like to be around. That's very hard to do, but that's why you take some time with the essays. Get your points down, get your story down, write a first draft of the essay, but then come back to it and say, does this feel like authentically me, or does this feel like anybody could have written it? And keep improving it that way. Get feedback from friends, from others on your essays. Essays are one of the two things you have the absolute most control over in your application. All right. Which business schools accept which exams? Basically, all MBA programs except the GMAT, and all the top MBA programs pretty deep down in the roster except the GRE, and they view the test basically the same way. Now, the EA is the tricky one. The EA is not accepted by anywhere near all schools, and not even by all the most prominent schools, and not even for their executive programs. So a lot of top executive programs accept the EA for admissions, and if you're going for an executive program and they accept the EA, probably do the EA because it is the best of the three tests. Its big drawback is honestly that it is not widely accepted yet. More and more schools are accepting it, including for full-time and part-time admissions, in addition to what it was originally designed for, executive admissions, right? Most prominently, Columbia, NYU, Duke, Sloan, and some other ones, maybe Booth, but don't quote me on that, are accepting the EA for full or part-time admissions. Berkeley, in fact, is accepting it for at least part-time admissions. The MSX program at Stanford definitely accepts the EA. And again, some of the top executive programs, Booth and Wharton, Columbia, NYU, all those accept the EA for executive. All right. Check the websites of the schools you're into to see which exams they accept, but also you can check if you're very interested in taking the EA, the executive assessment. They've got a website going with a list of all the schools that accept it, and it is an ever-increasing roster of schools, and it'll tell you exactly which programs at those schools accept the EA. That is a useful website to determining it. All right. Man, Vinayak, you're asking a big question. I know the Indian applicant school is huge right now. And again, I would say to distinguish yourself, it's usually test scores or essays. Those are what you have the most control over. Like, tell your story, make it uniquely you as much as you can, and you're going to be in pretty good shape. But again, there's only so much you can do, honestly. 720 is good. For M7 for an Indian with a broad work experience. Yeah, sorry, going back on some of these questions. Undergrad in civil engineering, experience in a different field. GPA was 8 of 10. If you're not aiming for the Ivy League schools, what GMAT score is decent? I would say high 600s would be a decent score. But let's see. Sorry if I'm missing some. These questions are all excellent. And take all of my recommendations with a grain of salt. I'm giving you general truths in these, hot take recommendations. I'm definitely not an admissions consultant. That should be made clear. And admissions consultants will maybe tell you the same thing or maybe tell you different things. I will defer to them in a lot of cases, but a lot of admissions consultants might also make it seem like you need a much higher score to get in than you actually need, because the higher the score is, the much more likely you are to get in, certainly, but you don't need that higher score to get in. Okay. Ideal length of essays, honestly, use about the capacity. They'll give you a word limit on essays. If they give you a 500 word limit, you're probably gonna, honestly, I've seen more people have trouble getting it under 500 words than getting it to 500 words. And you don't want to make it super concise, because again, the essay is your opportunity to tell your story in your voice, right? So that if it's short, it could probably do to be a bit longer. Add some humor to it, add some, detail to it, paint a picture for the schools, use those words to your advantage. All right. Go for the word limit. I would say just classically go for the word limit, right? Would I choose a free of cost master's in management for Germany or a paid MBA with 2.4 years of work experience? Rishad, great question. And honestly, it would really depend on where you were hoping to go with it. And I don't know. That's kind of a deep cut for me. I used to teach in Europe. I know a lot of people do masters in management, and I know it's seen, in Europe pretty well. And it would be like the difference between getting like the law masters in Europe versus a JD sort of thing. There's a chance that an MBA will open more doors for you across the world, but in Europe itself, I think Masters in Management is viewed very similarly to the MBA. So I might go for the free Masters in Management. Really, it's a cost-benefit analysis thing. Can you see any evidence that getting the MBA will increase your salary commensurately with the cost of the MBA? And compare that to how much having the Masters in Management will increase your salary at no cost. And you can maybe see when the payoff is. I just don't know the best way of getting that data, but that's the way I would try to decide it. I would say it would be a close call, honestly. And of course, you can do both. You can do the Masters in Management for free. And then if you decide later, no, I should have done the MBA, do it. But the MBA will probably, like if you want to take it to America or London or other places like that, the MBA probably has a bit more of an edge in terms of making you competitive for jobs. All right. Do the schools treat the exams differently? Look, there are rumors flying around about how the schools don't really like the GRE as much, but the truth is, if they accept the exam, they are kind of seeing it the same way, right? Again, score thresholds might be a little bit different. So the scores are very different. The scoring systems are very different on the two exams. I'm going to talk about this in a little bit. That ends up meaning that schools can kind of say, okay, aim for this score on the GRE, aim for this score on the GMAT. And those two scores don't necessarily represent the same level of relative ability or the same amount of studying necessary to get there or anything like that, okay? So that might be more the consideration. Which test can you do well on rather than, and well on relative to what the schools are asking for, I should say, rather than just like which school or which test is the school going to like. We did a survey of business schools, clearly 91 schools down there in the fine print. We asked, and basically all of them said, we view the GMAT and GRE equally. Now, they could have totally been lying to us, right? I would lie to us, but chances are they weren't. They waited a while to accept the GRE. The GMAT kind of had a monopoly on business school admissions for decades. And then the GRE changed, and business schools started accepting it more and more. And while the first couple of years, they may have been a bit tentative about it, because they didn't yet know how GRE scores would correlate to performance in their programs. With more time, they have, I think, found GRE is a fine predictor of success, and they definitely view the two tests equally. Now, the same may be happening to some degree with the executive assessment, except that since the executive assessment plays so much the way the GMAT does, even that's not really happening. And I'll put the executive assessment in context in a little while. The tragedy of the executive assessment. We'll talk about a little bit. Now, 10 years of work experience, not giving the GMAT or GRE might hurt your chances for a scholarship at least. And, might hurt your chances for admissions, because the longer you are outside of an undergraduate program, the longer your work experience is, the more they're going to say, I wonder if this person is up to being in an academic setting again and studying again, right? It's been a long time. So that even if, 10 years ago, you left college with a fantastic GPA, with each passing year, that GPA weighs less and less in the school's minds, right? So if you've got like 3 years of work experience after undergrad, they're leaning pretty heavily on your undergrad GPA. But if you got 10 years, they're kind of like, well, that was cool in its time, but that was 10 years ago. And I don't know, studying is different from working. Are you sure you're ready for it? The test can help with that. So I would say the longer you've been out of undergrad, the more the test gives you a chance to allay schools' concerns about your performance in an academic setting. And certainly, like in terms of scholarships and stuff, the test can really help with that. So I would say probably lean in favor of taking a GMAT or GRE, or possibly executive assessment. If you've got 10 years of work experience, a lot of schools will try to tell you, no, you know what? forget about that full-time program. You don't need it. Come to our executive program. They want you in their executive program. You don't necessarily have to. Even with 10 years of experience, you are totally a candidate for a full-time program. But some schools may try to push you in that direction. So be aware of that. There can be more opportunities for funding or scholarships there, but the truth is, like, if you've got full-time MBA program on your mind with 10 years work experience, don't let the schools talk you out of it. Even if it might seem, wait, if they're pushing me towards executive, does that mean they're going to like not look at my application favorably for full-time? No, the people who are pushing you towards executive probably won't even be reviewing your application. It's just admissions and outreach, trying to get you in that direction. All right. How much work experience helps to get into a desired MBA program? It really depends, but I would say usually if you're going for a full-time program, they kind of want to see 2 on the very low end, and they'd prefer 3 to about 7 or 8 years of work experience. That will be where a lot of the people in the full-time program are at. So if you have 10 years of work experience, you'll be one of the more seasoned people there, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. And again, business schools are looking for a well-rounded class, and that means definitely having some people with more experience. In fact, the person I told you about earlier who got a 750 and got kind of funding to some schools was going in at age 31 with about 10 years of work experience. And they did try to tell him, do the executive programs. And he was like, no, thanks. And he got into several full-time programs and a few with good funding for that. All right. Does volunteering and added certification provide added support in the application for top MBAs? Yeah, again, not if the volunteering is super recent, like you just started volunteering in the months before you applied. But if you've had a history of volunteering, absolutely yes. And other certifications definitely help. Actually, that's a really great question, because a lot of the other certifications require exams, and some of them super rigorous exams, 7-hour exams and things like that, CPA, CFA, stuff like that, for sure. That can help, because remember, they're looking at these test scores as a way of saying, this person can do the academic stuff. This person can study for something and do well at it, right? That's what they're looking for demonstration of from your undergraduate GPA from these test scores, because the way they see it, that's a good predictor of your success in school. Can you come to their school, study for stuff, and get better at it, right? So yeah, you can lean on those things pretty well. They seem to play well for these schools. Now, that might give you maybe a bit more of a buffer on what schools will accept from you on a GMAT or GRE. And if you're looking at test optional schools, the fact that you've taken those other tests, I think, really plays well. But it doesn't mean like if you've got a CFA that you should feel comfortable applying to Harvard with a 550. I mean, there's always like that one person who gets into Harvard with a 550, but you'd still want a score that's pretty decently high. It'll just probably give you maybe up to an extra like 30, 40, 50 points of buffer below their average score, so that you can apply with that kind of score and not really worry about it. All right. It is not usually better to apply directly after graduating from undergrad. Schools usually want a couple of years of work experience. If you have 4 years of total experience in different fields, absolutely simple MBA. They will probably not, like, you would be right at the very outside edge of eligibility, even for their executive MBA programs. And I think just about any school will say, you're a bit young for executive, or, a bit inexperienced, as the case may be. Maybe try applying to the full-time program. Is 700, 710 good for non-Ivy League top 50 colleges? Yes. Yes, it is a good score on the GMAT. I don't know what kind of quality of work experience totally is expected by the Ivy League schools. They will take, I don't know that there is any one type. They will take people of all experiences. And like I've been saying, schools tend to want a decently well-rounded class, right? So if you're coming from an investment banking perspective or background and you're applying to Harvard, right, they're going to get tons of people from an investment banking background applying. Tons. They're not going to accept all the investment bankers, because they don't want a class that is just investment bankers. They want a class with some investment bankers and some people who worked in entertainment, some marketers, some people who maybe just come from the arts and have no real business background, because that kind of class ends up being a richer experience. Like, you get a variety of perspectives and not everybody who thinks in just one professional way. So that you probably, like, don't worry so much about what kind of work experience will do it. Do the work you want to do. And as long as you can convince Harvard, like, look, you still fit into my bigger life plans from what I've been doing before to what I hope to do in the future, that's what matters. And I'm using Harvard as a stand-in for Ivy League schools, but obviously Columbia's Ivy League, and there are many others. All right. Master's GPA 3.71. What GMAT score should you target for NYU or Boston? I would say if you get 650 or above, you're in pretty good shape. That's a really good master's GPA as far as it goes. You've got decent experience, and especially Boston University, they're easier to get into in a lot of cases than NYU, and NYU will probably let you in with a high 600 score at that point, and pretty happily. So they're going to be leaning on that master's GPA in answer to Suyash's question. All right. I'll get to some other questions in a bit. Let's talk about the different tests. So is one test easier than the others? The answer is yes. The EA is much easier than the GMAT and GRE. It's a much shorter test, and score requirements aren't as high, with an asterisk now. Okay, look, if you were applying to schools like 3 years ago, I would say, and they accepted the EA, I would say absolutely take the EA, nothing to it, no question about it. 2 years ago, I would say absolutely take the EA, no question about it. However, in the last year, the EA has started changing because, like, Wharton, for instance, published average EA scores for admitted executive MBA candidates for the first time. And I believe the average score they published was a 157 on the EA. And up until that point, the general line was, look, if you do better than a 150 on the EA, you're pretty much fine for executive admissions. I mean, obviously there's the rest of your application, but score-wise, you were pretty much fine. Now it's starting to look a bit more like the other tests in which your score threshold's bumping up. People are trying to get better and better at it. They're holding themselves up to published averages, and it's a bit trickier. But a couple of years ago, the EA was the best because basically schools were just kind of using it as an excuse almost not to worry about your test scores. I had people get into executive programs with relatively low EA scores, and it was totally fine because schools didn't have to publish their EA averages, and so it didn't really get factored into rankings and stuff like that. Even now, as we speak, rankings are starting to change, and I think like US News and World Report is maybe no longer taking the GMAT scores of admitted applicants into account for ranking schools or something like that. I feel like I saw a headline to that effect the other day. So everything's changing in terms of how schools view these tests, and 3-4 years from now, this might be an entirely different calculus. Okay, but still for right now, the EA is objectively the easiest of the 3 tests, and there's still probably a bigger buffer on the EA score you can get in terms of like where it stacks up against their published or unpublished average EA scores vis-a-vis you're getting into the schools. Like you can score well under the average and still have a shot at getting into schools with an EA score if the schools require a test score and accept the EA. The EA is basically the one, unless again you're trying to go into consulting, investment banking, maybe private equity or some other similar fields afterwards. All right. GMAT and the GRE are definitely more of a commitment. And while there's a lot of similarities between the tests in terms of the content covered by the tests, there's still a lot more studying that needs to happen for good scores on the GMAT and GRE. All right. Now, studying for a test is not like a total waste of time. A lot of people look at it and say, oh man, why do I have to study just for this test? I'm never going to use this stuff in school. And that's true. A lot of the stuff you have to study for the test, you are not explicitly going to use in the business programs, but the very act of studying is something that's going to be valuable. Think of the test as kind of your like foot back in the door of academics and getting ready for that kind of thinking, especially if you've been working for a long time. All right, now getting to which tests. Do all of your schools that you're applying to accept the EA? Go for the EA. The EA, again, no brainer. It's so much easier than the other tests, and it is, like, in terms of thresholds, viewed more favorably by the schools, right? Do any of your schools prefer a certain test? Again, remember, there's not really a preference between the GMAT and GRE, but there might be a preference vis-a-vis GMAT and GRE versus EA. So if your schools prefer a GMAT or GRE, one of the bigger tests, definitely go for that test. Though if they're a test optional, again, you've got all those other considerations. All right. And here it is. If you do want to go into banking or consulting, definitely lean toward the GMAT, because a lot of banking and consulting firms ask explicitly for your GMAT scores, any GMAT scores from a test you've taken when you apply to them. And again, IR scores especially. In fact, I've helped friends kind of prepare for some consulting firms entrance exams, and those entrance exams are a lot like the integrated reasoning section on the GMAT and the EA. So that just studying for that section and getting pretty decent at it stands you in good stead to apply to a consulting firm later on and to do well on their entrance exam. All right. If you've already invested significant time in one test, then you can still switch. So if you've been studying for the GMAT for the last 3 months and you're like, well, now I'm kind of stuck. Not necessarily. All that studying will immediately carry over to the EA. And again, you'll probably be over-prepared for the EA, right? But what you'd really want to consider, especially if you're thinking about, like, you've studied for the GMAT and maybe you want to switch to the GRE or vice versa. And even if you haven't studied, this may be a consideration for you down the road. These tests are very switchable. There's a lot of overlap in the terms of the stuff you'd need to study to do well on one test and the other test. And I'm going to make it really explicit what the overlap would be for all these exams. But let me get to some of these questions. Would I say learning the language is key to management-based jobs in various European countries and business school? Yeah, probably, but I don't know. I had a friend who did his MBA in, I want to say, like, Germany or Switzerland. I cannot totally remember, but it was one of those like deep schools somewhere in Germany or Switzerland. I want to say it was Switzerland, but I would don't quote me on that. I think it was. And he never learned any language other than English because the whole program was done in English. And it was kind of a like remote program, or like he had to travel there, for 2 weeks at a time every now and then to get through it. And it was totally fine. But he was also not looking to stay in Europe and get a job there and stuff like that. I would say the language thing is especially important if you're looking to work there afterwards. Knowing them beforehand would probably be an advantage in the application, but if the programs are explicitly conducted in English, not knowing them shouldn't be a disadvantage, really. And any advantage you might get from knowing those languages would probably be somewhat slight, honestly. All right. Executive versus regular MBA for Adash's question. Regular MBA, you're basically there for 1 to 2 years, depending on where you're doing it, but you're not working during that time. And so it's not just the cost of the MBA program that you have to factor in, but also the cost of the income you're giving up to go to one of those programs. However, the regular MBA, the full-time MBA, gives you more chance for networking, getting to know your classmates, and the jobs afterwards and the way the schools support you in getting jobs afterwards can really help. Executive MBAs, on the other hand, is a bit more of a remote experience. It's harder to bond with your classmates, with your cohort in the same way, though there are definitely opportunities to do so. It's a bit harder to network through that. And a lot of people who are doing the executive MBA are actually explicitly doing so not with the idea that they're going to go and get a totally new, awesome job somewhere else, but rather with the idea that they're probably going to stay at the company they've been at and they want to get to the higher echelons within that company. It's not the only way to use an executive MBA, but that is like much more common for executive MBA people than it is for full-time MBA people. Full-time MBA is seen as a better opportunity to do a career switch or to really like elevate the kinds of jobs you can get into, but it does come at a pretty significant cost, right? Which is why funding can be so important for those programs. Does the bar for GMAT score vary for 1-year MBA versus 2-year MBA? I mean, yes, but that seems to be more school dependent. It's not super common for the same school to offer a 1-year and a 2-year MBA. It's much more like, the London schools have a lot of 1-year or 18-month programs. A lot of the Europe schools are 1-year programs. A lot of the US schools are just 2-year programs, and that's it. Like, you don't necessarily have the option. So the GMAT score probably varies, but that might just be as much about the school itself as it is about the fact that it's a 1-year or 2-year program. I don't know, again, Balash, I don't know how master's versus MBA is perceived in Europe, but I do get the sense that the MBA doesn't quite have the same ring in mainland Europe as it does in the UK and the US, where MBA as a distinction has been kind of growing in prominence over the last years and decades. That may well happen in Europe in the decades to come, but my very limited understanding is that master's of some kind and MBA would probably be viewed about the same in Europe. All right. And again, if anybody has better knowledge of that, please feel free to weigh in, answer our colleagues' questions. Right. Does the required GMAT score go up if you want to enroll in part-time instead of full-time? No, absolutely not. The required score goes down for part-time programs. There is less intake, but that is because honestly, fewer people are interested in the part-time programs. The way it tends to be is full-time programs have the highest test score requirements, part-time next highest, and executive lowest. And I think that's across the board fairly unequivocally. All right. Now that means the test score can really help you distinguish yourself if you're applying for a part-time program, but absolutely the requirement, I'm using the term loosely, is lower for a part-time program, 100%. All right. Talk about the exams, logistics, what's covered in them. All 3 exams are valid for 5 years, though practically speaking, they're valid for about 3.5 or 4 years. If you have a score that's 4.5 years old when you're applying to business schools, schools might say, could you take the test again and make sure you're still up to speed on this stuff? In much the same way that if your undergraduate GPA is pretty old, schools might not look at that as favorably. All right. Test length is a huge difference here. And as I said, the EA is the easiest by far. So if you are going through the test with classic timing, traditional timing, GMAT's about 3 hours, 3:15 or so. GRE is about 3.5 hours. The EA is 90 minutes long. Okay. You can, on all 3 exams, apply for and often get extra time if you have any sort of learning difference or history of accommodations like that. And that will obviously extend these times somewhat considerably. You can get double time and in some cases take the exam over 2 days, with the exception of the executive assessment. I guess you could do a 2-day thing there, but it's more rare. Scoring scales are totally different for the 3 exams. Costs are kind of on par with each other, though the EA is considerably more expensive. Also, number of attempts will be different. You can take the GMAT 8 times in your life and 5 times in a year. GRE, I think, is a bit more generous in terms of how many times overall you can take it, but still 5 times in a year. The EA, you can only take 4 times. And if you're going to take it all 4 of those times, 2 have to be taken in person, 2 have to be taken online. All right. The EA is the test that you have the strictest limit on in terms of retakes. Okay. And that can be a consideration, but really what that means is if you're going for the EA and you end up using all 4 of your takes, remember, it's not the end of the world. You still have the GMAT and GRE to fall back on, and having studied for the EA, you've got a huge leg up on your GMAT studying as well. All right, there you go. Good scores for top schools tend to be above a 710 for the GMAT, in the 160s for the GRE, though you have a little bit of room on the verbal score, depending, of course, on your background. The quant score really needs to be in the 160s. And for a top school, if we're being honest, you probably want a quant score in the mid to high 160s if you're taking the GRE. On the EA for an executive program, you're pretty happy with a 150 still, and even a high 140 score can do it for you as long as your quant score is in the double digits. And the better you can get the quant score for the EA, the better your application is going to look to schools. They'll forgive a bit on the IR section and the verbal section if you've got a good quant score there. For a full-time MBA, though, you want to aim for the mid 150s at least and above if you can get there. If you get an EA score in the 160s, you've got a great score as far as it goes, and you don't have to worry about your score in any way, shape, or form whatsoever. All right. But even if you're in the 150s, you've got a real shot at even full-time programs, again, as long as your quant score is as high as it can be. All right. Decade-long work experience require over 700 score for Ivy League top schools? Not necessarily, but it could certainly, I would say, probably a good idea to get a score in the 700s, but you wouldn't count yourself out if you've got a score in the very high 600s, even for top Ivy League schools. It's just, again, if you've got a decade of work experience, they are going to be looking at this test score as evidence that you can do pretty well. I would say if you're applying with a score in the high 600s, you'd still probably want a quant score that's pretty strong. And by pretty strong, I mean for top schools, you ideally want your quant score to be 47 or above on the GMAT, because indeed the GMAT gives you a score of 800, and that's the first score anybody's looking at, but they'll also break down your score into your quant score, your verbal score, and then separately from your score out of 800, your IR score and your essay score. And they're looking first at your score out of 800, but then second, very quickly, at your quant score. And so if you're, applying with a high 600 score, that might give them a moment's pause. But if they see that your quant score is 48 or 49 or something like that, that'll set their minds at ease usually. All right. Okay, content. Now, this is where we really get to the overlap. What's going on, or what's differentiating these tests from each other? All of them basically agree on the quant content, with the exception of the EA, which does not have as much geometry. It still has coordinate plane stuff on occasion, no geometry. However, all three tests will have fractions, decimals, percents tested, right? Ratios pretty heavily tested. All three of the tests will have a lot of algebra content, okay? All three of the tests will have a lot of word problems. And, within the word problem categories like statistics, rates and work, just straight algebraic translations. All three tests have that. All three tests have probability and combinations and permutations as possibilities that'll show up, but they tend to show up a bit less on most of the exams. The GRE can sometimes be pretty heavy-handed with the probability, but that very much depends on luck of the draw. And actually, one thing I've noticed in taking these exams over the years is the GRE can be the most unpredictable of the exams in terms of you take it 1 month and it seems like this is the most heavily tested area. You take it the next month and it seems like that's the most heavily tested area. But what I would say is, generally speaking, the GRE will reliably have more geometry content on it and will likely have more in the way of probability and sets and stuff like that. Okay. The GMAT will have a lot of word problems, loves percents and ratios, and a decent amount of algebra on it. And the EA is the EA loves percents and ratios and stuff like that. Has word problems, but usually on the simpler side. And just overall, the EA's questions tend to be less difficult than those on the GMAT and GRE. Even if you're performing at roughly the same level, the EA tends to have just less complex questions in a lot of cases. All right. Paul, great question. Yes, the online GMAT now, it plays out exactly like the test center GMAT, which means not only does it have all 4 sections, and to be clear, you might find some information on the internet that says the online GMAT doesn't have an essay section. It does now. So it's not just that it has all 4 sections, but also the online GMAT now has the same 2 8-minute breaks that the in-person GMAT always has had. And the online GMAT now gives you your unofficial score immediately after the exam instead of making you wait a few days. Okay, so the online GMAT is starting to feel a lot more like the in-person GMAT. That is completely correct. All right. Verbal-wise, there's total overlap between the GMAT and the EA. They have the same 3 types of verbal questions: reading comprehension, critical reasoning, in which you strengthen or weaken an argument or whatever it may be, and grammar, sentence correction. All right. Same on the GMAT and the EA. The difference is the GMAT, or the EA rather, has much fewer questions than the GMAT, but same categories. The GRE is the odd one out in terms of verbal. And this is actually one of the major factors, I would say. If you're decided you're going to take a test, you see that your school accepts maybe just the GMAT and GRE, the verbal differences are the biggest ones, okay? Because where the GMAT has a question type, sentence correction, that tests grammar, or at least uses grammar as kind of its vehicle for what it's testing, the GRE has a question type that uses vocabulary as its vehicle. And maybe that's not a problem. You can memorize vocabulary. There are tons of flashcards out there available to help you learn the words you need for the GRE, but it's a lot. It will take a long time. There are only so many words you can learn day to day and hope to, retain them, essentially. Which means if you're studying for the GRE or looking to study that and your vocabulary is a little bit low, it can end up taking longer to study for the GRE just because vocabulary learning ends up being the bottleneck for that. All right. And there are 1,000 words you can learn before going into the GRE. And even then you might see 20 of those words on the GRE and still be hit with words you haven't really seen before and you're not familiar with. Vocabulary is one of the hardest things to overcome on the GRE. Now, as I said before, luckily, most business programs are not taking the GRE's verbal score super seriously, okay? But you still don't want to apply with like a terrible verbal score. And so vocabulary could be the one big difference. It's easier to learn the grammar necessary for the GMAT and the EA in a shorter amount of time than it is to learn the GRE's vocabulary stuff, okay? Integrated reasoning is only on the GMAT and EA, and it's fairly identical on the two sections with one exception. It's not on the GRE. However, the GRE does have a small data interpretation section in each quant section. So 3 questions of data interpretation per quant section. That's kind of like stuff you'll see on the IR section, but easier, frankly. And GMAT has 1 essay, GRE has 2 essays. GMAT grades its essay a lot more gently than the GRE does. Like, honestly, I've never gotten a perfect score on the GRE essay, and I've never not gotten a perfect score on a GMAT essay. And the EA has no essay whatsoever. So if essay writing in a timed controlled setting is a worry for you, the EA might be the way to go, assuming you can take it. All right. Now, all 3 exams have an adaptive thing going on. The GMAT is the most intense in terms of its adaptive nature because it is question adaptive, meaning whatever question you're on, you have to answer it. Right or wrong, you have to put in an answer to get to the next question. And you're never coming back to that question once you've answered it, because the way you've answered it, right or wrong, determines the difficulty bracket of your next question, whether it ticks up a little bit or ticks down a little bit, okay? And that means every question on the GMAT, you have to like see and decide, am I going to do this question or just let it go quickly? And if you're going to let it go quickly in the interest of time, you've got to put in an answer that you don't believe in and know that you can never come back to it. And it's kind of like, it's an intense experience. You definitely want to take some practice tests ahead of the GMAT to get used to that experience, okay? The GRE and the EA have the major advantage that they are section adaptive, which ends up on a practical level, meaning that you can go back and forth among the questions. You don't have to just finalize a question upon answering it. You can even skip questions, not answer them at all, and save them for the end of the section, okay? That is a much, much less intense test-taking experience, all right? Now, the way the adaptive thing kind of works is basically the better you do, the harder the questions are, and the kind of higher your score ticks up, right? But it also means, especially for the GMAT, that you can miss a lot of questions and still get a fantastic score. I once, on one of the GMAT practice exams, missed 20 questions on a quant section and still came away with a 47, because it's not really on the GMAT about how many questions you miss. It's much more about how difficult those questions are. The GRE and the EA are a bit more sensitive to number wrong. And I should specify, when I say your score on the GMAT is not really about how many questions you miss, that's very true on the quant section. You can miss 10, 11 questions and come away with a 49 on the official exam. I've seen it happen several times, okay? 10 or 11 out of 31 questions on the GMAT's quant section, you can get wrong, still get a 49, which is a fantastic score when you consider that the quant section is out of 51 points, all right? You can't really do that on the GMAT verbal section, though. There you try to get everything right. Nor can you really do that on the GRE or the EA. If you miss 10 questions on the GRE's quant section, between the 2 quant sections, actually, I should say, so there are 40 total questions in quant on the GRE, 40 counted questions. If you miss 10 questions of those 40, you're probably squeaking by with like somewhere in the 160 to 162 range, right? Which is an okay score, but nowhere near the 49 that you can get on the GMAT having missed 10 of the questions, all right? So the GMAT, because of its algorithm, is actually a bit more forgiving of questions wrong. And notice you can miss about the same number of questions and get vastly different scores on the GMAT. It really is about how difficult or easy those questions are. And don't take away from the way this is set up in the beginning that like it actually depends on how you do in the beginning. It's more how these people did in the beginning was a function of what their ability levels were. Then, you know, person 2, student 2 should have done better in the beginning and then he or she would have been fine. No, not necessarily. The test is adapting to what you can do, and you can have some stumbles in the beginning and totally recover it. All right. The big difference is student 1 overall was doing more difficult questions throughout the exam. And so the questions student 1 got wrong were on the harder side. And basically, the harder the question you get wrong, the less it hurts your score. That's true on the GMAT. It's also actually true on the EA, just to a lesser degree. All right. Paul, you probably want to set your date a few months out. Usually it takes at least, I would say, 3 months, 2 to 3 months to study well for the GMAT. But you don't need to set a date now unless that date is going to motivate you to study better. You can certainly schedule the GMAT without much lead time, especially going into the next seasons, which are not heavy times for the GMAT. You will be pretty free to schedule an exam when you want to. I should say, though, that it's harder to schedule an in-person exam lately than an online exam because the online exams are available 24/7, and you can usually find an exam at a decent time of day for your local time zone, just 2 days, 3 days out from when you decide to look for an exam time. If you want to take it in person, you probably want to start looking at exam days a little bit earlier, especially if you're hoping to take it on, say, a Saturday or something. All right. But there's not a huge incentive to schedule it well ahead of time, unless, again, having a deadline will help motivate you to get the studying done. All right. Paul, great question. So 51 points is the number of points in the section for the GMAT Quant and Verbal, but it definitely does not mean it's like 1.65 points per question at all. Remember, people have missed 10 or 11 questions on the official exam and gotten a score of 49, right? The number of points that each question is worth, and this is a weird way of putting it, but essentially the number of points each question is worth depends more on the difficulty of the question. So that if you miss a really hard question, that might only cost you like 0.3 points off your 51 or something along those lines, or 0.5 points or something like that. Whereas if you miss an easy question, that might cost you like 3-4 points straight up. Okay. And you don't know if you're getting an easy or a hard question. That's one of the frustrating things about these exams. Even on the GRE and the EA, which are section adaptive, you don't totally know whether you've gotten the easier or harder section. You can kind of guess, but it's hard. The way section adaptive works, by the way, on the GRE and the EA, you do a section or a half section in the case of the EA, and your performance on that section will govern how difficult the second section of that type is, or the second half of the section. So like GRE has 2 explicitly separate quant sections and 2 explicitly separate verbal sections, plus one more quant or verbal section that is experimental, uncounted, but you won't know which one it is. So you have to treat it as though it's a normal section. The EA instead has 3 sections, the IR, the verbal, and the quant, but each section is broken up into 2 halves, and you're free to move about the first half. Once you finalize your answers for that first half, that dictates the difficulty of your second half of the section, and you can no longer go back to the first half. And ideally, you're getting the harder second section in the EA or the GRE if you're doing them, because that's what's going to give you your best chance to do well. And that's where, again, the tests might be a little bit more forgiving. You can miss more of the hard questions and still come away with a decent score than if you get the medium second section, or especially the easier second section, at which point you have to be really on it and try to get just about everything right. Okay. You can get official practice GMATs at MBA.com. Create an account with them, which you'll have to do to register for the test anyway. And they make 2 free official practice GMAT cats available to you just for creating the account. That'd be the best place to go. However, all private companies, including ours, Manhattan Prep, have at least 1 free practice exam available to people. So you can do that too, but the GMAT has their own, and they're quite good. You might want to save them for a bit later, or maybe take one now, see kind of where you're at and where your weaknesses are. Don't review it all that heavily so that you might be able to repeat it again later. GMAT people also make a few more practice exams available for money, but they make 2 available for free. All right. So pros and cons, basically, in terms of the adaptivity, the GRE and the EA have a huge advantage over the GMAT. The GMAT is super intense. However, the GMAT's big advantage to the way it's adaptive, especially in the quant section, is you can make more than a few careless mistakes and still get a great score, whereas you're getting punished pretty quickly on the GRE and the EA for mistakes you make even in the quant section. Again, the verbal section on the GMAT is still pretty intense. You have to miss very few questions to get a score, even in the 40s. Like if you miss more than 6 questions on the GMAT's verbal section, it can be hard to get a score in the 40s. Okay. But the quant section is graded much more gently on the GMAT. It's still a very intense experience though. Okay. Pros on the GRE, basically you can skip around within a section, and that's cool because then you can prioritize easier questions first, save harder questions, harder for you questions for last, and not have those harder questions blow up your time for the whole section or anything like that, right? You can deprioritize questions that look like they're going to be time consuming, and you should. All right. So if you're debating between the two exams and you want to keep your options open for a while, I mean, one, I would say study for one test for about a week, take a practice test, study for the other test for a week, take a practice test, and see how you do relative to what your schools are looking for in terms of your scores on each of those tests. Now, the EA is a little tricky because there aren't that many practice tests available. The main ones made by the GMAT people are only available, again, behind a paywall. However, I believe GMAT Club has a practice EA now, and more, I think, private enterprises are coming out with practice EAs, so you can kind of get a sense of where you're at through those. Still, the official ones tend to be pretty spot on in terms of the score they give you. There are different question types for each of the exams. So before you take a practice test for either one of the exams or any one of the exams, learn its unique question types, at least in terms of the format of the questions, what they're looking for, some like light methods on those questions. And you can find plenty of resources online or even in the official guides, and then take a practice test for it. However, if you're looking to keep your options open as long as possible, you can study a lot of the same quant content. And as we said, it'll cover both exams. Moreover, for the verbal side, reading comprehension and critical reasoning are on both exams. The real difference is the sentence correction and the vocabulary, which means if you do want to keep your options open for the GRE and you want to put off the decision for a while, it's probably a good idea, even if you're still kind of studying mainly for the GMAT, let's say, to start picking up vocabulary as early on as possible so you don't have to try to cram vocabulary, which will not work. All right. To keep your options open for the GRE, start learning vocabulary now, yesterday. All right. Shashikant, that's a question that's better asked of the schools because I don't know for sure. Possibly still yes, but I think different schools determine whether you need to submit IELTS depending on either your undergraduate GPA or your like the main language of country of origin or things like that. So just see what the school tends to say. You can probably talk them out of it, but if you have a decent enough IELTS score, there's no reason really not to. If you don't, that's when you might want to talk the schools out of it, or if you just don't want to give the IELTS, that I can understand. All right. Now, let's say you take these two practice tests. The way to analyze the results is not, so there's this GRE to GMAT or vice versa conversion tool available online on the GRE website, actually. Don't use that to determine like, okay, I got these GRE scores, let me plug them in and see what my equivalent GMAT score would be, because it always makes your GMAT score seem kind of terrible by comparison, which in turn makes you think I'm not doing so well on the GRE. Just see where you're at vis-a-vis your school's scores and especially your school's quant scores, okay? If your weaknesses are confined to a very test-specific thing, like you're doing terribly in the vocab questions for the GRE, maybe switch to the GMAT then. If you're doing terribly in the grammar questions or say the data sufficiency questions on the GMAT or the EA, might want to switch to the GRE. All right. And you also want to determine whether you should switch from one test to the other based on your time frame. Okay. So Paul, yeah, everybody says 3 to 4 months of work for the GMAT, but it doesn't usually mean 8 hours a day for 90 to 120 days. It usually means more like 2 to 3 hours per day for the 3 to 4 months. That time frame is usually what's given to people who are working while preparing for the exam. If you do have full time to study, even if you do, I wouldn't say 8 hours a day would be the best. I would say even if you have full time available to study, you should probably cap it at about, at a push, 5 or 6 hours, more reasonably at about 4 hours per day. Because again, there's only so much the brain can take in of studying from day to day. But you could probably expect to get it done in about 2 months at that rate. Still, the 3 to 4 month time frame is very much with like working professionals in mind. All right, it's a great question. All right, now let's look at some of the problems that you might expect from the exams. A problem like this, for instance, would be very at home on all 3 exams. Okay, might look a little different on the 3 exams, but it would be very at home. This is something that we tend to call a problem-solving problem. And basically, most questions on the quant section, or yeah, I'd say most questions on the quant section of any of the 3 exams we're talking about will look like this. All right, problem solving or discrete quant in the case of the GRE. You're going to have 5 answer choices in these questions, with the exception of the GRE, which has a slightly different format sometimes in which you can select all that apply, or even the GRE has some questions in which you have to write in your own answer. That's usually 1 or 2 questions per section, but it's there. The majority of your questions on the EA's quant section, GMAT's quant section, GRE's quant section will look like this. 5 answer choices, choose the best one. And you can sometimes use the answer choices to your advantage, as is actually the case here. You could try out different numbers of seashells that Francine has, and it might be a more practical way to solve this problem than by setting up a formula. Now, one gigantic difference between the GRE and the GMAT/EA that I have not mentioned until right now is the GRE gives you an on-screen calculator for its quant sections. It's not the huge advantage you might think it is, but it can be a huge time saver, if nothing else. The reason the GRE does it is they're thinking, well, this problem is going to be difficult anyway, because if somebody takes 25% of 200 and subtracts that away, gets 150, which you might well do with the calculator, that's still a trap answer. Actually, that'll still treat you wrong. So the calculator is not an advantage in avoiding that trap. And the GRE says, look, we know the difficulty of our test. The difficulty of the test is taking in the information in the right way, being careful with the words, and doing the math in the right sort of direction, especially with questions like this. And I will say, full disclosure, I took the GRE last September. I got a lot of questions that were basically like this question on it. Tons. All right. The calculator was a big help there, but you still have to know how to set up the question the right way, right? The way to set up this question, if Abdullah has 25% more seashells than Francine, is basically the way it's written. Abdullah has whatever Francine has plus 25% more of that number. All right. Not take 25% of what Abdullah has and subtract it away, but take 25% more than whatever Francine has and get to the 200 that Abdullah supposedly has. And if you have a calculator, it's really easy then to take this, divide 200 by 1.25, and end up with the correct answer of 160. But you do not have that calculator luxury on the GMAT's quant section or on the EA's quant section. That is where it can help to really like plug in answer choices and say, okay, if I take 160, 25% of that, a quarter of that would be 40. If I add that on, boom, I get to 200. So 160 is looking pretty good, because under no circumstances without a calculator do you want to be dividing 200 by 1.25. That's an option on the GRE. It's harder on the GMAT or EA. You'd probably want to turn the 1.25 into the fraction 5/4, then multiply 200 by the reciprocal 4/5, and so get to an answer that way. Which means by not giving you a calculator, the GMAT and EA are kind of asking you to do some, mathematical acrobatics to get to an answer. But all 3 tests are going to give you a question like this in which there's a clear trap answer you can pick and see whether you can avoid picking that trap answer. All right. It's true. GMAT Club is absolutely one of the places to practice and to get explanations for questions. You'll also find a lot of explanations to official guide questions on YouTube, actually. So if you need better explanations than the official guide can offer, which you do because they are terrible, go to GMAT Club or YouTube for sure. All right. See problems like this, again, percents are very at home on all 3 exams, without a doubt. And questions like this are among them, a percent change question. However, one of the scariest parts you'll hear people describing about the GMAT is the data sufficiency section, right? And this isn't exactly what it looks like, but this is the kind of mentality that goes into the data sufficiency section. Really what it'll look like is more, instead of saying like a given x equals 3 here, they'll give you 2 givens. One called statement 1, x equals 3, and the other may be called, well, not maybe, definitely called statement 2, but maybe it says something like y equals 2. And basically your job is what's said in words up here, right? The idea is, okay, if you're only given the fact that x equals 3, can you get a firm answer to that question up above? All right. Will that be enough to get a single numerical answer to that question, what you can do is either try to simplify the question from the jump. Algebraically speaking, there's a huge advantage to being able to simplify questions and such. And if you're feeling really confident in your algebra, that's always going to be an advantage on the exams, right? So like, for instance, here, you could factor out the x in both terms on the top. You'll be left with an xy plus a 5. And that then will cancel with the x on the bottom of that fraction. You can simplify that further because now you've got xy plus 5 over y minus 5 over y. And the question ends up becoming xy over y, at which point the y's cancel, and the question simply asking, what is the value of x? And it might look initially like if you were only given that x equals 3, it wouldn't be enough information to answer that question because you'd need to know something about y. But then it turns out that all the y's cancel out, and the question is simply dependent on knowing the value of x. And so if you are given the value of x as 3, you call that sufficient. You say, yeah, that's enough information to be able to answer the question. Nice thing about the data sufficiency type, which, by the way, is on both the EA and the GMAT, but is not on the GRE, is that you don't necessarily need to do all the math for it. But as you see here, you do derive pretty huge benefit from doing the math in a lot of cases. And so even though they'll say you don't need to do the math, you just need to determine whether the math could be done to get to a single or consistent answer to the question. Oftentimes you do need to do the math. However, data sufficiency, while it can be logically really tricky, especially in the case of yes/no questions, is also a lot more forgiving of slight mathematical missteps or things like that than the problem solving or discrete quant type. In this case, by the way, statement 2 would not be sufficient because the y has disappeared from the question. The question is in no way, our ability to answer the question is in no way dependent on the value of y. And so statement 2 would be useless to us. Statement 1, however, would be useful to us. And the answer by data sufficiency rules would be A, the first answer. Statement 1 is sufficient. Statement 2 is not. Right? Right on here. Yeah, exactly. Never assume on data sufficiency questions. And it is always the hard way with data sufficiency questions. And the same's true for me. Like, look, data sufficiency questions were definitely the hardest thing I had to learn when I first started teaching GMAT years and years ago, but they are learnable, all right? The methods are learnable. Learn how to test cases well and carefully for yes/no questions. Learn when to do math on the question stem versus doing math in the statements. And data sufficiency can be very, very learnable, all right? And you'll be okay. The kind of corresponding question type on the GRE is something called quantitative comparisons. And while unfortunately I don't have an example of one here, they're pretty straightforward in that they basically ask you, all right, is quantity A bigger? Is quantity B bigger? Are the two equal? Or can you just not tell from the information given? And that's why it's the corresponding question type, because as with data sufficiency, sometimes on those questions, you just don't have enough information to be able to answer. But quantitative comparison is dramatically easier, which is to say, if you're thinking you want to keep your options open for both tests, I would say, while you need to learn vocabulary on the side for GRE purposes, you should also be doing a lot of data sufficiency on the GMAT. It's the harder one, and it'll over-prepare you for quantitative comparisons. Whereas if you study just quantitative comparisons and try to transfer those skills to data sufficiency, it doesn't necessarily translate as well. Okay. And with that, you guys, I'm going to wrap this up because we're at about our time. Listen, thank you for all your questions. I hope I answered like most of them, if not all of them. I really tried to get to them, and I appreciated your asking. Thank you for coming. Look, I work for Manhattan Prep. We have a promo code. If you're interested in our classes, check them out. And if you have any questions, use this promo code, GMAT Club 75. If you have any questions about the exams that you still want to ask or that I didn't get to, I'm sorry for that. But my email address is right there at the bottom of this screen. Feel free to write it down, ask me those questions, and I will happily answer them at some point. All right. Thank you very much for coming today. I appreciate you, and have a great rest of your day, evening, night, whatever it may be. All right. I'll see you around.